She was 20 broke, and had nowhere left to go, so she bought an abandoned chapel in the woods for just $1. But hidden beneath the altar was something no one had touched in over 50 years, and it would quietly change the course of her life forever. If this story stayed with you, even just a little, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. It really helps more stories like this find the right people. And I'm always curious, where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? There's something kind of special about knowing these quiet stories are reaching people all over the world. Claire Holloway turned 23 days before she found the letter, though found isn't really the right word for it. It had been slipped under her bedroom door sometime during the night. Quiet enough that she hadn't heard it. Deliberate enough that it didn't feel accidental. She noticed it only because the edge of the envelope caught the early morning light, a thin line of white against the worn wooden floor. For a moment she just stood there, barefoot, staring at it like it might explain itself if she gave it enough time. The house was silent in that particular way it always was in the mornings. Not peaceful, just restrained, like something holding its breath. She already knew what it was before she picked it up. You don't live in someone else's house for 3 years without learning how silence works, how disappointment moves through rooms without ever raising its voice. Diane Carter had never been cruel, not in any way you could point to. She paid her bills on time, kept the kitchen spotless, folded dish towels with the kind of precision that suggested control mattered more than comfort. But over time something had shifted. Conversations had grown shorter, pauses longer. Questions like "what are your plans?" had stopped sounding like curiosity and started sounding like deadlines. Claire opened the envelope sitting on the edge of her bed. The letter inside was typed, neatly formatted. The kind of message you could tell had been rewritten several times to sound kinder than it felt. Diane explained that after careful consideration, she believed it would be best for Claire to find her own place, somewhere she could make decisions without feeling judged. There was a line thanking her for the time they had shared, another wishing her well, and then the part that actually mattered: 2 weeks. Claire read it twice, slowly, not because she didn't understand it, but because reading it again delayed having to react. When she finished, she folded the paper along its original creases and slipped it into the back of her notebook. The one she kept everything in: ideas, fragments of conversations, descriptions of strangers she'd never see again. It felt appropriate that the letter lived there now. Just another piece of something she hadn't quite figured out how to use yet. She went downstairs and made breakfast the same way she always did: 2 slices of toast, butter spread thin so it melted all the way through, a cup of coffee she let sit too long before drinking. Diane was already at the table, reading something on her tablet. "Morning," she said without looking up. Claire answered the same way. They didn't mention the letter. Diane asked if she wanted more coffee. Claire said no, thank you. The conversation moved around the thing that mattered most, like it had been carefully trained to avoid it. After breakfast, Diane left for her book club, and the house shifted again, exhaling this time, settling into a quieter kind of stillness. Claire sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and opened a dozen tabs she'd already looked at before: apartments she couldn't afford, shared rooms with strangers who wanted first and last month's rent up front, listings that looked decent until you read the details and realized they weren't. She checked her bank account again even though she already knew the number. $247. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough to make a mistake with. She had known this was coming, in the way you know a storm is building long before it rains. Diane's patience had been thinning for months, worn down by Claire's vague answers, her lack of a clear plan. The way she talked about writing like it was something that might eventually become real instead of something that needed to be structured and scheduled and turned into income. Diane believed in stability. Claire believed in something she couldn't quite define, which made it difficult to defend. So instead of looking for something temporary, something that would keep her moving from place to place, Claire started searching for something else entirely. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for until she found it. A listing buried on a county auction site, the kind of page that hadn't been updated in years, full of properties no one wanted. Landlocked parcels, collapsed mobile homes, buildings in towns she'd never heard of. And then there was the chapel. The description was almost nothing: old stone chapel approx. 400 square feet, no utilities, access by foot only, condemned in 1974. Starting bid 1. Claire clicked on the single photo attached to the listing. It was grainy, probably decades old, showing a small structure barely visible through a wall of trees. You could make out the roofline, the suggestion of a cross at the top. The way the building seemed to exist quietly within the forest rather than interrupt it. There was something about it that didn't feel abandoned so much as left alone. Like it had been waiting without expecting to be found. She stared at the image longer than she meant to. Long enough that the rest of the tabs on her screen started to feel irrelevant. Like they belonged to a different version of her life. One she wasn't sure she wanted to step back into. Renting a room, finding a job that paid just enough. Explaining herself over and over again to people who needed her to make sense in ways she couldn't yet. The chapel didn't ask for any of that. It didn't promise anything either, which made it strangely honest. Claire leaned back in her chair and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The logical part of her mind listed all the reasons it didn't make sense. No electricity, no water, no road, a building that might not even be safe to enter. But another part of her, quieter and harder to argue with, kept returning to the same thought. It would be hers. Not borrowed, not temporary, not dependent on someone else's expectations. For the first time since she'd read the letter that morning, Claire felt something close to clarity. Not certainty she wasn't naive enough to mistake one for the other, but a direction. A decision that didn't come from avoiding something, but from moving toward it, even if she couldn't fully explain why. She reached for her notebook, flipped past the letter, and wrote down the name of the town listed in the auction, Little Falls. Then she underlined it once carefully, the same way she did with anything she wanted to remember. Claire didn't tell Diane where she was going the next morning. There didn't seem to be a version of that conversation that wouldn't sound either ridiculous or like a quiet act of defiance. And she didn't have the energy for either. Instead, she left a short note on the kitchen counter out for the day, back later and slipped out just after sunrise with her notebook, a small backpack, and the last bit of cash she was willing to spend without overthinking it. The bus station in Albany was already half awake when she got there. People moving with that tired, automatic rhythm of early travel, coffee in hand, eyes still adjusting to the day. Claire bought a ticket to Little Falls, the name still feeling slightly unreal as she said it out loud, like she was testing a line of dialogue she hadn't decided she believed yet. The trip took longer than she expected, not because of distance, but because of the waiting in between. One bus turned into another, then another, each transfer adding a layer of distance between her and everything she was supposed to figure out. She didn't mind it. There was something calming about being in motion without needing to explain why. She ate a granola bar somewhere between stops, read a few pages of a book she'd already read twice, and spent most of the time looking out the window as the city slowly gave way to smaller towns, then open fields, and eventually the kind of landscape that didn't feel like it belonged to anyone in particular. By the time she reached Little Falls, the air felt different, cooler, quieter, carrying that faint scent of leaves and water that told you were no longer anywhere near a city. The courthouse was easy enough to find. It sat near the center of town, a brick building that looked like it had seen the same routines play out for decades without much change. Inside, everything was clean but worn in a way that suggested use rather than neglect. Claire paused for a moment near the entrance, suddenly aware of how strange her plan sounded when placed in a normal setting. Buying a condemned chapel for $1 wasn't the kind of thing people did on a Tuesday morning. But she'd come this far, and turning back now would mean going back to searching listings she already knew wouldn't work. The clerk's office was quiet, just one woman behind the counter, glasses hanging from a beaded chain, flipping through a stack of papers with the kind of steady focus that made interruptions feel like they needed a reason. Claire stepped forward anyway. "Hi," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "I'm here about a property listed on the county auction site. The chapel on Old Logging Road." The woman looked up, and for a second there was nothing in her expression, just a pause while she placed the words. Then something shifted, recognition mixed with something else Claire couldn't quite read. "That old place," the woman said, setting her papers aside. "You know it's been sitting there for years, right? Nobody's touched it in decades." Claire nodded. "I read the listing." The woman studied her a little longer, not unkindly, just carefully, like she was trying to understand what kind of person shows up alone asking about something like that. It's not livable, she added, more gently this time. No utilities, no road access. You'd have to walk in, and it's not exactly a short walk. And the structure itself, well, it's been through a lot of winters. Claire listened, taking it in without interrupting. None of it was new information, but hearing it out loud made it feel more solid, more real. I understand, Claire said finally. And she did, at least as much as anyone can understand something they haven't experienced yet. The woman glanced down at the counter where Claire had placed a single dollar bill, slightly creased from being folded into her notebook. There was a moment where it could have gone either way, where the woman might have pushed back harder, asked more questions, suggested something more practical. Instead, she let out a small breath, almost a quiet resignation, and reached for a form. "All right," she said, her tone shifting into something official but not unfriendly. "If you re-sure we can process it. Just know what you re-getting into." The paperwork was surprisingly simple. A few signatures, a brief explanation of the property's status, confirmation that she understood there were no guarantees, no protections beyond what was written. Claire signed where she was told, her handwriting small and precise. Each letter shaped carefully as if that alone could make the decision more deliberate. When it was done, the woman handed her a copy and a small, old key that looked more symbolic than functional. "That's it," she said. "It's yours." The words landed heavier than Claire expected. Yours, not temporary, not conditional, just hers. Outside, the town moved on like nothing had happened, people going about their day, cars passing by. The quiet hum of a place that didn't need to be noticed to exist. Claire stood there for a minute, the key in her hand, the paper folded in her bag, trying to match the simplicity of the moment with the weight it carried. She had just bought something most people wouldn't even consider stepping into, and somehow it felt less like a risk and more like a step towards something she couldn't yet name. The road leading out of town was narrower than she expected, gravel giving way to packed dirt as she followed the map on her phone. The further she walked, the quieter it became, the sounds of town fading until all that was left was the rhythm of her own steps and the occasional rustle of wind through trees. There was a point where the road curved and a weathered wooden sign came into view, leaning slightly to one side. The lettering faded but still readable if you stood close enough. Quiet Forest Chapel, Private 1923. It didn't look like something meant to attract attention. If anything, it looked like something that had been content to be overlooked. The path beyond it was barely a path at all, more a suggestion than a direction. Branches lay scattered across it, some small enough to step over, others requiring her to slow down and find a way around. Moss-covered parts of the ground, soft underfoot, damp in places where sunlight rarely reached. Claire moved carefully, not rushing, letting herself adjust to the pace the place seemed to demand. It wasn't difficult, exactly, but it required attention, the kind you couldn't fake or rush through. As she walked, she became aware of how different this felt from everything she had been trying to do before. There were no listings to compare, no prices to calculate, no expectations to meet. Just a direction and the quiet understanding that she had chosen it. It wasn't about proving anything to Diane or anyone else. It was about seeing where this would lead if she followed it all the way through. When the trees finally opened up, it wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden reveal, no moment designed to impress. Just a small clearing, and at the center of it, the chapel. Smaller than she had imagined, but more solid, more real. The stone walls held a kind of quiet strength, weathered but still standing. The roof sloping upward to a simple cross that leaned just slightly to one side. It didn't look abandoned in the way empty buildings usually do. It looked patient. Claire stopped at the edge of the clearing, not stepping forward right away. There was a feeling she couldn't quite explain. Something between recognition and hesitation. Like she had arrived somewhere that mattered without knowing exactly why. She had expected to feel uncertain, maybe even regretful. Instead, what she felt was something steadier. Not confidence, not yet, but the absence of doubt. After a moment, she stepped forward, the ground beneath her feet soft with fallen leaves. The door stood closed, heavy wood framed by stone, marked by time but still intact. She reached out, her hand resting briefly on the surface, feeling the coolness of it, wait, this was it. No turning it into something else, no pretending it was anything but what it was. A decision made, fully, without a backup plan. Claire pushed the door open slowly, the hinges resisting at first, then giving way with a low, drawn-out sound that echoed faintly inside. It wasn't loud, but it felt like something shifting. like a space that hadn't been disturbed in years was acknowledging her presence. She stepped inside, letting the door fall partially closed behind her, and stood there for a second, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the stained glass above. She didn't say anything, there was nothing to say. But somewhere in the quiet, in the stillness that filled the room, she felt it again, that same subtle pull that had made her stop on the listing, that had carried her all the way here. Not an answer, not a promise, just the sense that this place, for reasons she didn't yet understand, had become part of her story the moment she chose it. Claire didn't open the box right away. At first it just sat there on the altar, heavier than it looked, like it carried more than just whatever was inside it. She had slid the stone panel back into place after pulling it out, almost instinctively, as if putting things back the way they were mattered even now, even here. The chapel was quiet in a way that made small movements feel louder than they should be. Every step echoed softly against the stone floor, every breath noticeable. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it wasn't empty either. It felt occupied, somehow, though she knew that didn't make sense. She walked the length of the room once, slowly, taking in the details she hadn't noticed when she first stepped inside. The benches were simple, worn smooth in places where hands must have rested over and over again. Dust lay across them, but not thick, not abandoned in the way she expected. The stained glass above the door filtered light into soft, muted colors that shifted slightly as clouds moved outside. Nothing about the place felt dramatic or haunted or even particularly remarkable. And yet, standing there, she couldn't shake the feeling that this place had been important to someone, in a way that didn't fade just because people stopped coming. When she finally returned to the altar, she rested her hands on the box again, her fingers tracing the edges of the wood. It was old, that much was obvious. The corners were reinforced with tarnished metal, and the latch had rusted just enough to suggest it hadn't been opened in a very long time. For a second, she hesitated, not out of fear exactly, but something closer to respect. Whatever was inside had been left there on purpose. Someone had decided it should be found, but not easily. She glanced around the chapel again, half expecting to see something she had missed before, some sign that she shouldn't be doing this. There was nothing, just the quiet, steady presence of the room itself. So she reached for the iron rod hanging near the wall, tested its weight in her hand, and brought it back to the box. The metal latch resisted at first, stubborn in that way old things are, but it didn't take much. The rust had done most of the work already. With a sharp, dry snap it gave way. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing briefly before disappearing into the stillness. Claire froze for a second, listening, as if expecting some kind of response. When none came, she let out a slow breath and lifted the lid. Inside, everything was arranged with a kind of care that immediately told her this wasn't random. The first thing she noticed was the stack of envelopes, tied together with a thin, faded ribbon. They were aged but intact, each one sealed with a small, red wax stamp. Not decorative, not ornate, just a simple mark pressed firmly enough to last. Beneath them, partially hidden, was something else. She shifted the envelopes gently and saw it neatly bundled cash, secured with twine, and beside it, a small leather pouch. Claire didn't reach for the money first. That would have been the obvious reaction, maybe even the expected one. Instead, she picked up the envelopes, feeling the slight stiffness of old paper between her fingers. There were more than she thought at first. She counted them slowly. 17. Each one addressed the same way, in careful, deliberate handwriting to the next keeper. That phrase sat with her for a moment. Not owner, not visitor, keeper. She untied the ribbon and selected the top envelope, turning it over in her hands. The wax seal cracked easily under gentle pressure, brittle with age, and the paper inside slid out with a soft, dry sound. The ink hadn't faded much. Whoever had written it had taken their time. She began to read. The letter was dated 1971. It introduced a woman named Margaret Lindholm, who explained that she believed she would be the last person to come to the chapel. There was no drama in her tone, no attempt to make the moment feel larger than it was. She wrote the way people do when they're certain of something and don't feel the need to convince anyone else. She described the chapel's origin, how it had been built decades earlier by a man named Father Ansel Voigt, not formally recognized. Just someone who believed in creating a place where silence could exist without interruption. As Claire read, the room seemed to shift slightly around her, not physically, but in the way understanding changes how you see something. The benches weren't just old wood anymore, they were places where people had sat with grief they couldn't explain. The walls weren't just stone. They were something built slowly, deliberately, by someone who had needed this place as much as anyone who came after. Margaret's letter continued, explaining how a small community had formed over the years, people drawn not by tradition or obligation, but by the simple need to sit somewhere without being asked questions. They didn't always pray. Sometimes they just sat. That line stayed with Claire longer than the others. Then the letter shifted. Margaret wrote about the box, about the money, about the coins in the pouch brought from another country, carried across an ocean by someone who had chosen not to spend them. She explained that the funds had been meant for the chapel's care, but there had always been more than needed, and so they were left, passed forward, not to a specific person, but to whoever found them. To the next keeper, Margaret had written, "Take what you need. Care for this place if you can, and if you cannot, then simply return from time to time and sit in the silence. That is enough." Claire lowered the letter slowly, her hands resting in her lap, the paper still open between her fingers. For a long moment she didn't move. The air in the chapel felt the same as it had before, cool, still, unchanged, but something inside her had shifted in a way she couldn't quite name. She reached for the pouch next, loosening the drawstring and tipping it gently into her palm. The coins were heavier than she expected, cool against her skin. Their surfaces worn but still marked with faces and symbols she didn't immediately recognize. They didn't feel like something meant to be spent. They felt like something carried. The money beneath them was more straightforward, countable, usable, real in a way that connected immediately to her situation. She didn't count it right then. She didn't need to. The presence of it alone changed the shape of what was possible. And yet, that wasn't what stayed with her most. It was the idea of being chosen not in some grand, destined way, but in something quieter. The chapel hadn't reached out to her. It hadn't called her name. She had found it through a listing most people ignored, followed a path most people wouldn't take, and opened something that had been waiting without expectation. Claire folded the letter carefully and slid it back into its envelope, placing it on top of the others. She didn't open the rest. Not yet. It felt wrong to rush through them, like flipping through someone else's memories just to get to the end. Instead, she closed the box gently and left it on the altar, exactly where she had found it. Then she sat down on one of the benches, the wood creaking softly under her weight, and looked out across the small, quiet space. The light from the stained glass had shifted again, stretching across the floor in muted colors that moved almost imperceptibly. She didn't think about what she was going to do next. Not in a practical sense, not yet. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to just sit, without planning, without calculating, without trying to turn everything into a next step. And in that stillness, something settled. Not an answer, not a solution. Just the quiet understanding that whatever this place was, whatever it had been to the people before her, it was now something she was part of too. Not because she owned it, but because she had found it and chosen to stay. Claire didn't spend the money right away. That would have been the obvious move, maybe even the smart one, find a small apartment, buy herself time, rebuild something that looked like a normal life. But every time she thought about it, something held her back. The money didn't feel like hers in the way money usually does. It felt entrusted, like it came with a quiet expectation. Not written anywhere except in the tone of that letter, and the weight of everything that had been left behind. So instead, she found a small room in a boarding house in Little Falls. It wasn't much, just a bed, a narrow dresser, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot, but it was cheap. And the woman who ran it didn't ask many questions. That mattered more than comfort. Claire paid for a week up front and told herself she'd figure out the rest later. Every morning, she walked. The first few days, the walk felt longer than it actually was. A mile doesn't sound like much until you're recarrying tools, cleaning supplies, and the quiet pressure of not knowing if any of this will work. The path didn't get easier just because she'd been on it before. If anything, it demanded more attention. Loose branches, uneven ground, spots where the soil dipped unexpectedly beneath her weight. But after a while, her body adjusted. The rhythm of it became familiar. Step, breathe, watch where you're going. It was simple in a way her life hadn't been for a long time. When she reached the clearing each morning, the chapel was always the same and always slightly different. The light hit it at new angles, shadows shifting depending on the time of day. Sometimes there was a light layer of fog that lingered just long enough to soften the edges of everything. Other times it was clear, almost sharp, every detail visible in a way that made the building feel more solid, more present. It never felt empty. She started with the roof, because that was what made sense. If the structure didn't hold, nothing else mattered. Claire didn't know how to fix a roof, not really, but she knew enough to know when something was beyond her. So she asked around in town, found a man who did repairs, and explained the situation as simply as she could. He hesitated at first, not because of the job itself, but because of the location. "You were telling me I have to carry everything in?" he asked, looking at her like he wasn't sure if she was serious. Claire nodded. "It's not far," she said, which was only partly true. He studied her for a second, then shrugged. "All right. But it's going to take longer." It took 3 days. Claire watched him work, not hovering, but paying attention. The way he moved across the roof, careful but confident, replacing what needed to be replaced, sealing what had been left exposed for years. At the end of it, he climbed down, wiped his hands on a cloth, and looked at the chapel like he was seeing it properly for the first time. "You take care of it," he said, not really as advice, more like a statement. "This thing'll outlast both of us." Claire nodded, not trusting herself to say anything that wouldn't sound too certain or not certain enough. After the roof, she moved inside. Cleaning took longer than she expected. Not because it was difficult, but because she didn't want to rush it. Dust had settled into every surface, not thick enough to suggest neglect, but enough to dull everything slightly. She started with the floor, sweeping carefully, then going back over it with water and a brush, working in small sections. It wasn't about making it look new. That wasn't the point. It was about uncovering what was already there. The benches came next. The wood responded differently than she thought it would, the grain darkening slightly as she worked oil into it, bringing out a warmth that had been hidden beneath years of quiet use. She found herself wondering about the people who had sat there, what they had carried with them, what they had left behind. There was no way to know, not really, but the question stayed with her anyway. The stained glass took patience. It wasn't something you could rush or scrub clean without damaging it. So she worked slowly, wiping away layers of dust from the inside first, then the outside as best as she could reach. The colors shifted as she went, becoming clearer, more defined. Blues that had looked gray began to deepen. Reds regained something close to their original richness. It wasn't dramatic, not all at once, but it changed the way the light moved through the space. It made the chapel feel awake. Weeks passed like that, measured less by days and more by what had been done. Claire fell into a routine without meaning to. Wake up, walk, work, sit, walk back, eat something simple. Write a little, not much, just enough to keep the habit from disappearing completely. Sleep. Repeat. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was the first time in a long while that things felt steady. The caretaker's cabin came later, almost by accident. She hadn't noticed it the first time she visited the chapel, too focused on the building itself. But one afternoon, while walking the edge of the clearing, she saw it, a small structure, partially hidden by trees. The roof slanted slightly from years of weather. It looked like it might collapse if you leaned on it too hard, but when she stepped closer, she realized it was still holding together. Inside it was simple, a bed frame, a small table, a rusted stove in the corner. Dust, yes, and signs of long disuse, but not beyond repair. It felt different from the chapel, less formal, more personal. This had been someone's living space. Someone had woken up here, made meals, written letters, lived quietly within the same rhythm Claire was beginning to understand. The realization came slowly, but once it did, it felt obvious. She didn't need the boarding house. It took time to make the cabin livable. New floorboards where the old ones had softened, small repairs to keep the cold out, a basic system to collect rainwater. None of it was perfect, but it worked. And when she finally moved her things in what little she had, it didn't feel like settling for less. It felt like stepping fully into something she had already chosen. Winter came sooner than she expected. The first snowfall changed everything. The path became harder to navigate, the cold sharper in a way that didn't care if you were prepared or not. There were mornings she considered staying in the cabin, letting the chapel sit closed for a day. But she didn't. Not because anyone was expecting her to open it, but because something about the act of showing up mattered. So she did. Every morning, she walked the short distance from the cabin to the chapel, pushed the heavy doors open, and let the quiet settle around her. Some days no one came. Most days no one came. But occasionally someone would. The first was an older woman, moving carefully along the path, her steps slow but deliberate. She didn't say much when she arrived, just nodded slightly to Claire and took a seat in the back. She stayed for nearly an hour, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. When she left, she paused briefly, touched Claire's arm lightly, and said thank you. Then she was gone. It didn't feel like much in the moment. Just a small interaction, easily overlooked. But it stayed with Claire longer than she expected. After that, others came. Not many, not all at once, but enough to notice a pattern. A man who had been hiking and stumbled onto the path. A woman who had heard about the place from someone else. People who didn't ask for anything, didn't expect anything. They just sat. Claire didn't guide them, didn't try to explain the space or give it meaning. She understood now that it didn't need that. The chapel worked because it didn't demand anything from the people who entered it. It allowed them to bring whatever they carried and leave it, or not, without pressure. Somewhere in the middle of all that, Claire began to change in ways that were harder to track. It wasn't sudden. There was no moment where everything shifted at once. It was quieter than that. A gradual adjustment, like her life was aligning itself with something steadier. She started writing again, but not the way she used to, not stories about imagined people or places she had never been. What she wrote now was smaller, more immediate. Observations, fragments. The way light moved across the floor at different times of day. The sound of footsteps approaching from the path before you could see who they belonged to. The silence not empty but full in a way she hadn't understood before. At night, sitting in the cabin with a small lantern casting just enough light to see the page, she would write until her hand grew tired. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to remember. Claire didn't think of herself as the owner of the chapel. That word never felt right. But slowly, without needing to say it out loud, she began to understand what the letters had meant. She was the keeper now, not because she had been chosen in any grand, undeniable way, but because she had stayed. By the time spring came back around, Claire stopped thinking of the chapel as something she had to manage and started understanding it as something she simply lived alongside. The seasons had a way of doing that to a place and to a person. Winter had stripped everything down to its quietest version, forcing her into a rhythm that didn't allow shortcuts. Now, as the snow melted and the ground softened again, there was a different kind of movement in the air. Not louder, not busier, just returning. The forest filled in around the clearing once more, greens replacing the dull grays. The sound of water somewhere nearby growing stronger with the thou. The chapel didn't change much on the outside, but the way it sat in the world felt different, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for months. Claire noticed things she might have missed before. The way the light came through the stained glass in the early morning was softer now, less sharp than it had been in winter. The air inside carried a faint warmth by midday, enough that she no longer needed to keep her jacket on all the time. Small details, but they added up. Living here had trained her to pay attention in a way she hadn't before, not out of effort, but because there wasn't anything competing for her focus. People still came, slowly, unpredictably. Some days no one showed up, and those days didn't feel empty anymore. They felt complete on their own. Other days, someone would appear on the path without warning. Stepping into the clearing with that same expression, Claire remembered from her first day, a mix of hesitation and something quieter, harder to define. She had learned not to interrupt that moment. Whatever brought them here usually needed a few seconds to settle. One afternoon, a man in his 40s came through, his movements careful but not slow, like he wasn't sure if he should be there but had decided to come anyway. He nodded to Claire when he saw her, a small acknowledgement, then walked straight to one of the benches and sat down. He stayed there for nearly 2 hours, didn't speak, didn't move much, just sat, hands resting on his knees, staring forward. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated near the door, then turned slightly toward Claire. "I didn't think places like this still existed," he said. His voice wasn't emotional, not exactly, but there was something underneath it. "I'm glad it does." Claire nodded, because anything more would have felt unnecessary. He left the same way he came, quietly. Moments like that began to define the days more than anything else. Not dramatic, not life, changing in the obvious sense, but steady. Real. The kind of interactions that didn't demand attention but stayed with you afterward. Claire stopped trying to interpret them, stopped wondering what people were thinking, or what they had brought with them. It wasn't her role to understand. That was something she had come to accept slowly over time. In the evenings, she would sit outside the cabin, sometimes with her notebook, sometimes without, watching the light fade across the clearing. The chapel would darken gradually, the stained glass holding onto the last bit of color before giving way to shadow. It was her favorite time of day, not because anything happened, but because nothing needed to. There was a completeness to it, a sense that the day had been exactly what it was supposed to be. She thought about the letters often, though she hadn't opened all of them yet. They were still in the box beneath the altar, right where she had found them. She had read a few more over the months, spacing them out without deciding to. Each one added something small, another voice, another perspective, but none of them tried to define the chapel in a way that limited. That was what struck her most. No one had tried to turn it into something fixed. They had all understood, in their own ways, that the value of the place was in what it allowed, not what it required. The money, too, had changed in meaning for her. At first, it had felt like a solution, a way out of the uncertainty she had been living in. Then it became a responsibility, something she had to justify using. Now it sat somewhere in between. She used it when it made sense: repairs, supplies, small things that kept both the chapel and the cabin functioning, but she no longer thought of it as something that defined her situation. It was part of the story, not the point of it. What stayed with her more than anything was the silence. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of it. The way it held space for whatever came into it. The way it didn't push back or demand explanation. Back in Albany, silence had felt uncomfortable, something that needed to be filled or avoided. Here, it felt like something solid, something you could step into without losing your footing. Claire began to understand why the chapel had lasted as long as it had. It wasn't because someone had protected it constantly, or because it had been preserved in any official way. It had lasted because people had recognized what it was and had chosen, one by one, to leave it intact. Not untouched, but unchanged in the ways that mattered. She thought about Diane sometimes, about the letter that had started all of this. There was no resentment there anymore, not really. If anything, there was a kind of quiet appreciation, though she wasn't sure she would ever say that out loud. Diane had wanted Claire to make her own decisions, even if it came from frustration, and Claire had. Just not in the way either of them might have expected. One evening, as the light faded and the first hints of summer settled into the air, Claire sat on the stone bench near the chapel door and watched as a pair of deer moved carefully along the edge of the clearing. They didn't notice her, or if they did, they didn't see her as a threat. They paused briefly, ears alert, then continued on, disappearing back into the trees as quietly as they had arrived. She stayed there a while longer after they were gone, the stillness settling back in around her. The chapel behind her was closed for the night, the doors pulled shut with the same steady motion she had repeated for months now. It was a simple routine, but it mattered. Opening in the morning, closing at night. Not because there were rules, but because consistency gave the place a kind of rhythm. Claire didn't think of herself as someone who had found her purpose. That word felt too large, too final. But she did understand something now that she hadn't before. Some places aren't meant to be owned or transformed or even fully understood. They exist to hold something: grief, memory, silence, whatever people bring with them. They do it without asking for anything in return. And sometimes those places wait. Not for a specific person, not in a way that suggests fate or destiny, but in a quieter, more patient way. They remain unchanged until someone comes along who is willing to see them for what they are and stay long enough to understand. Claire stood up after a while and walked the short distance back to the cabin, the path familiar now. Her steps steady without needing to think about them. Behind her, the chapel sat in the clearing, exactly as it had been when she first arrived, and yet not the same at all. She had come there with nothing, not even a clear idea of what she was looking for. And somehow, without trying to define it, she had found something that didn't need to be named to be real. Not a new life. Not a solution. Just a place that made sense to stay. She came here with nothing. No plan, no direction, just $1 and nowhere else to go. And somehow, this forgotten chapel in the middle of the woods didn't just give her a place to stay. It gave her a reason to stay. There's something about this story that stays with you, but not in a loud or dramatic way. It's quiet. Almost easy to overlook if you were not paying attention. And I think that's exactly the point. Most of us are taught to look for big turning points in life, clear plans, obvious opportunities, moments where everything suddenly makes sense. But Claire's story doesn't work like that. She didn't have a plan. She wasn't chasing success or trying to prove anything. She was just pushed into a corner, forced to make a decision with almost nothing in her hands. And instead of choosing the safe or logical path, she chose something uncertain, something that didn't even guarantee survival, let alone success. And somehow, that's where everything began to make sense. I think the real lesson here isn't about the chapel, or the money, or even the idea of starting over. It's about paying attention to what quietly feels right, even when it doesn't look impressive from the outside. Because not every meaningful path is obvious. Some of them look irrational at first. Some of them don't come with validation or support. And sometimes, the things that change your life the most are the ones nobody else would understand if you tried to explain them. Another thing that stands out to me is this: Claire didn't find her purpose in some big, cinematic way. She didn't wake up one day with clarity and direction. She found it by staying, by showing up every day, even when nothing happened, by taking care of something small, something quiet, something that didn't ask for recognition. And that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. Because it means purpose isn't always something you discover, it's something you build slowly through consistency, through choosing not to walk away, even when things are uncertain. I also think there's a deeper idea here about space, about how important it is to have somewhere, even just one place, where you are not being judged, not being rushed, not being asked to explain yourself. The chapel wasn't special because of what it had. It was special because of what it allowed: silence, presence, and the permission to just exist for a moment without pressure. And maybe that's something we're all missing more than we realize. So if there's anything to take from this, it's not go buy a chapel in the woods. It's this: you don't need to have everything figured out to move forward. Sometimes, all you need is one small decision that feels true to you, even if it doesn't make sense yet. And if you were lucky, if you keep showing up, if you stay long enough, that one decision might quietly turn into a life that finally feels like your own. Not perfect, not easy, but real.